Being a segment leader is actually a very difficult job because it means that you live in constant fear that at some point you're going to lose that position. You see, the throne of leading a segment is something that's rather fickle because the moment a competitor comes out that is slightly more stylish, slightly better equipped, slightly more efficient, or has better badge value, off you go. That was the case for the Honda CR-V when the PROTON X70 arrived, and since its arrival, the X70 has retained its position as the best-selling C-segment SUV on the market. However, it's been about 3-4 years now, and since then the X70 has only had a few minor refreshes. It even looks exactly the same as when we got it. The only big difference is there is now a 1.5-litre 3-cylinder engine up front instead of the 1.8-litre 4-cylinder that it got when it arrived. Proton claims that this makes the X70 more fuel efficient without any compromise in terms of refinement. But is that really true? And more importantly, would you rather spend your money on something else, be it the Honda CR-V, the Toyota RAV4, if you can stretch for it, or anything else for that matter? Or should you stick with the price leader, the segment leader, the car that defines the C-segment SUV space here in Malaysia? Well, in this review, we're going to find out. My name is Aiman Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring, and before we get into it, be sure to hit subscribe and hit the bell to be notified every time we make a new upload. Ladies and gentlemen, the PROTON X70. Now, to provide a little bit of history, the PROTON X70 was the first model to be introduced after the partnership between Proton and Chinese automotive manufacturer Geely. And as a result, it was required of them to then produce and market a vehicle within 1 year. So it is argued that the X70 is a little bit of a rush job. And that's kind of why the X70 looks the way it does, which is exactly the same as its Chinese counterpart. The only difference here being that we get a unique grille, which incorporates the infinite weave design framed by the ethereal bow. I can hear you gagging now. And for the MC2, which is what this one is called, we also get gloss black inserts here with a little bit of silver contrasting down there and some scuff plates over there. This ruby red is a color that's been around ever since the beginning, which I think is quite a fetching shade, although the MC2 now gets 19-inch alloy wheels in this design for this update. Previously, this design alloy wheel was only available on a Merdeka edition, which has since faded into obscurity. But personally, it's the profile of the X70 that I feel kind of betrays its age. Because if you look at the PROTON X50, for example, which is a much newer car, you will see that the profile is a lot more dynamic, it's a lot more bold and in your face. Whereas the side of the X70 reveals the fact that this is an older vehicle because it looks very much like a two-box typical SUV design. But that said, it's not that it's ugly, it's just old. And like I said, from here you can get a better view of those 19-inch alloy wheels, which I think really do fill up the arches quite well. You can, aftermarket, admittedly, get 20-inch alloy wheels and so on, but honestly the 19s look just about right, and if you're putting 20s on it, it's a family car, and think about it. Now, you do get roof rails up here which are functional, so you can put a roof box on your X70 should you want to, and roof rails are standard across the range if I'm not mistaken, which means you do have some added practicality should the boot not be big enough. Now, talking about practicality, the X70 does have a kind of a small boot. It's not as large as you'd expect from something of this size. The Honda CR-V and the Toyota RAV4, and actually the Toyota Corolla Cross for that matter, have larger boots. But that said, it is a decent enough size, and in terms of loading things in and out, the X70 does actually sit quite high, so you have to lift things into the boot. But there isn't really that much of a load lip, which means once you're there, it should be easy to load stuff in. And of course, if you want, you can just reach over and fold these seats down 60-40, although these seats are very heavy, and so it's almost impossible to do from here. And they fold almost flat. But closing the tailgate, which takes a little bit of time, reveals that the back end of the X70 is much like the front. in which I mean it's neat, but it's not particularly remarkable. Now, talking about the lights very quickly, the tail lights are an LED combination, so the indicators in the reverse lights are bulb. Up front, you also get bulb indicators, but the rest of the front lighting system is LED. You get LED headlights, LED fog lights, LED turning lights, if I'm not mistaken, they're called. And overall, it's a pretty neat thing. Inoffensive, I think, is the word I'd use for it, but let's see if that lack of innovation continues inside. Well, in terms of technology, the interior of the X70 does impress to a degree. You get a kind of small infotainment system, but I think it's adequately sized, which does offer screen mirroring through Easy Connect, I believe the app is called, and it does have the much vaunted High Proton voice assistant, which does a variety of things, although honestly I find it a little bit gimmicky. And ahead of me sits a digital instrument cluster where I get all the information that I need, and it actually looks, in terms of the interface, very similar to what we used to get in the previous generation of Volvos, but somehow just downgraded a little bit. Anyway, in terms of driving position, that's another issue that I have with this car, because no matter what I do with the seat and the steering wheel, it's like the steering wheel doesn't come close enough, and then I have to position the seat close to the steering wheel, but then I get kind of uncomfortable, and then I put my seat to where I'm sat comfortably, but then the steering wheel's too far away, and then my arms start to ache. It's really weird, the ergonomics in this car, and it's very similar to what I got in the X50, where again, you just can't quite get everything where you want it to be. But that said, the steering wheel is at least reach and rake adjustable, and the driver's seat in this car is electrically adjusted as well. The passenger seats one is too, although only the driver gets lumbar support and height adjustment, so that's whatever. You don't get memory functionality, but you do get dual zone climate control, which is quite nice. And for the executive and premium models, you also get ventilated seats, although unlike in other cars, the ventilation is only on the seat base and not on the seat back. So it's basically an ass cooler and not much more than that. We also get a new gear selector for the X70. I think this was introduced for the MC1 and it carries over into the MC2. And this is supposed to be a trigger style selector where it's now going to beep at me, where it's very easy for you to just press the button and pull to select the gear that you want, provided that you allow the car to scream at you. You also get the electronic parking brake here, a couple of cup holders, and a decently sized center armrest, although it's not that deep because this armrest top actually includes a built-in ionizer, and so some height was sacrificed in order to make room for that mechanism. Your 12-volt socket is in here, as well as a single USB port, although in case you're worried, there are also USB ports down here on either side of the center console, and also one more behind the rear view mirror to facilitate the installation of a dash cam, which I think is quite good. Now, specific to the premium are these brown Napa leather seats, which I think are quite nice, although the premium does not get a panoramic sunroof. If you want that, you have to set up to the Premium X, which also comes with the 1.8 litre engine, and anyway. But overall, this interior does look pretty good. Tactility is all rather good as well, because the quality of the controls does feel markedly better than what you'd expect from Proton, although this was something that the X70 set out to achieve, and achieve it has. Now, in the back of the X70, things are pretty good because sat behind myself, I have a good amount of knee room and a good amount of headroom. And as you can see, even with my feet kind of pushed all the way back here, I still have very good under thigh support, which is not something that can be said of a lot of vehicles in this segment or within this price range. I also get a couple of air vents back here, again, not a given at this price point, and a couple of USB-A ports, which is great because it does mean that passengers in the back are pretty much cared for. The Napa leather continues back here. The door cards are of a similar quality as the ones in the front, so it's all very nice, soft touch and rather plush. And if I want cup holders, they live here in the center console underneath this little lid. Now, overall, the back end of the X70, I think, is a great place to be for passengers because it's practical, it's spacious, and it's generally quite nice. And you also get, I almost forgot, a two-stage recline function. So if you want to sit more upright, you can, or you can recline the seat a little bit further back, although I would have preferred a handle somewhere down on the side, but it's a feature nonetheless. That said, however, if you're using this as a family car, please be aware of the fact that the window line in this car is quite high, and so children may not be able to see out. And on top of that, this car does not come with sun blinds in the back. again, not a normal thing in this segment, so please be aware that you might need to tint the car additionally in order to keep UV rays away from young children. But like I said, back end of this car is alright, front end of the car is alright, so what is it like to drive? Will it be alright there too? Now the thing about the X70 is that this is actually my first time reviewing this car. I've only driven the X70 once before, and that was on a long distance trip to Desaru, where we got to sample this engine in a fast sort of highway type setting. And I remarked during that review, or in that first look video, that the fuel consumption in this car was not nearly as impressive as Proton touted it to be. So has this particular test period changed anything? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. So before we talk about fuel consumption, naturally we have to talk about the engine. So under the bonnet is a 1.5 litre 3-cylinder turbocharged engine shared with the Proton X50. Now, it produces a little bit less power and a little bit less torque compared to the 1.8 litre 4-cylinder that it replaces. However, Proton says that because peak torque is now delivered earlier by about 300 RPM, it means that the difference, or rather the reduction in overall output, has been mitigated. Now, that is true. In terms of the way this car feels, because although I haven't reviewed an X70 1.8, I do have a friend with one and I've driven his car rather extensively. So, although there is less performance and you can somewhat feel that little bit of a reduction at the top end, most of the time when you're driving around in town doing town speeds and going about your business, you can't really feel the performance deficit. So that is a good thing for sure. That said, however, what you can feel, despite Proton's best efforts, are the 3-cylinder characteristics. So for this engine on this car, there is actually a variety of different measures that Proton has put in order to reduce or completely remove a lot of the noise as well as the vibrations that come from the 3-cylinder engine. So in terms of noise, Proton has added a significant amount of sound deadening and dampening to the cabin, and as a result it means that, again, when you're just driving normally like I am now and like how I have been for almost 600 kilometers, you can barely hear the engine at all, let alone the characteristic 3-cylinder rumble. This car is amazingly quiet, and again, provided that you don't really go past about 3000 RPM, this car is very, very muted, which means there is no 3-cylinder rattle to hear at all. And then there's the vibrations. So because this 1.5 litre engine was co-developed with Volvo, now Volvo has a very long history with plenty of experience dealing with odd-numbered or odd-cylindered engines. For example, Volvo for a long time had a fantastic set of 5-cylinder engines, which were very characterful and rather powerful, mind you. I had one for a little while. But because of that experience, it means that Volvo was able to find a way to develop and tune this 3-cylinder engine in such a way that there was almost no deficit and cost in terms of refinement. And sure enough, as we're driving this car around, there are very few vibrations to be felt in the cabin. It's just that at lower RPMs and at lower engine speeds, sort of below 2000 or below 1500 RPM, especially if you're in eco mode and the car is trying to accelerate in a higher gear, you will feel a little bit of rattle. And of course, naturally, when you start the car up, it does vibrate just a little bit more than the 4-cylinder. But again, these are relatively small niggles. However, if your Proton sales advisor is telling you that they've completely removed the 3-cylinder characteristics, they're lying. They are here, they're just very, very well managed. And that theme of things being well managed continues to the rest of this car in terms of how it drives. Because as I've said before, and as I've said on my Instagram page for that matter, the Proton X70 is not a car designed for driving enthusiasts. This is not a car that is going to set your heart on fire, because that was never the point. The X70 is a mid-size family SUV which is designed to haul the family back and forth and haul yourself back and forth from home to work in the least amount of fuss and in the most amount of comfort that it can manage. And to that end, the X70 does that incredibly well. As I mentioned earlier, this car is very, very quiet, so that's already half the matter done. And even when you're cruising at highway speeds, it's not until you go well past the national speed limit that air or wind noise actually starts to creep into the cabin. In terms of road noise, there is almost none at all thanks to the Continental Ultra Contact 6 tires on this particular premium car, and that makes this a very pleasant place to be. The other half of the comfort equation naturally comes from the ride, and that's where I mentioned that this is not for driving enthusiasts, because the X70 is very softly sprung. If you believe that a Proton should drive like a Proton, like for example the Saga, which is an incredibly good car to drive despite its diminutive package, and the same goes for the Persona and the Iris, then unfortunately the X70 is not going to impress you that much, because unfortunately the suspension in this car is very, very soft. Now, for the MC1, which is when they swapped out the badges and all that on the X70 to the new round Thundercats logo, Proton actually reworked the suspension ever so slightly, so this is now technically slightly better and slightly more uniquely tuned for the Malaysian market compared to the original fully imported X70. That said, however, this retuning, while no doubt has given this car a little bit more of an edge, it's still not the sharpest edge, because this is not a driver's car. But Proton understands that. Proton understands that X70 buyers are looking for a comfortable SUV, and it nails that brief perfectly, because the X70 takes the very worst out of the lumps and bumps. It practically irons them out, and as a result it means that you can make good progress very comfortably over a longer time, and you will be fine. And I quite appreciate that character to the X70, because it feels like every SUV, or in fact every new car on the market, is trying to be the next best handling thing. It's trying to set your heart on fire, and as a result some compromises have to be made. Whereas with the X70, Proton has decided that no, what we want is a comfortable family car, and that is exactly what they've managed to achieve. It's comfortable, it's quiet, and as far as I'm concerned, this is a fantastic car, especially a quick note when you add in the fact that the premium and executive models come with ventilated front seats, which is a fantastic feature. Thank you, Proton. However, not everything is a garden of roses in this car, because yes, while it's very comfortable and it's very quiet and it's rather practical, even though the boot is slightly on the small side, unfortunately the fuel consumption isn't quite so great. Because you see, all the things I mentioned earlier are the makings of a fantastic touring car. The sort of car that you can get in, stick in some fuel and drive for hours and hours and hours without concern. These seats are very comfortable, and as I mentioned, the NVH levels in this car are very respectable, and so technically you'd think that this car would do that. Unfortunately, you'll have to stop for fuel quite often, because Proton touts a 20% improvement in fuel economy or something to that effect by moving to the 1.5 from the 1.8. However, the 1.8 was known for being rather thirsty, and so the 20% improvement, if at all, hasn't really made that much of an improvement. And on the whole, this engine is not exactly the most frugal thing anyway. So I've been driving this car for about, where is the trip computer? I've been driving this car for about 567 kilometers, during which time I've had to put in about 20 liters of fuel in order to reach this number, on top of the full tank that this car already came with. And the average that I've received, bear in mind I've been driving this car with eco mode on about 70% of the time. I haven't really been caught in traffic, and I've been driving very gently-ish. This car is still returning about 10.1 liters per 100 kilometers, and that is really not a good figure. Vehicles like Honda's CR-V will return much, much lower fuel consumption figures. In fact, even the 2.5 liter Toyota RAV4 does a better fuel consumption figure than this. This is really, really bad for what is ultimately a two-wheel drive mid-size SUV. But But on that end, I did a little bit of a calculation. So the PROTON X70 Premium, as I'm driving now, is about 112,000 ringgit. Now at 112,000 ringgit, the next competitor would be the Honda CR-V, and you have to get it with the full bells and whistles model in order to get the same advanced driver assist features like this car has. And that is roughly a 150,000 ringgit car because, you know, Honda has lots of discounts. There's not many people buy them. And the gap in between, in terms of a monthly installment over 9 years, works up to about 350 to 550 ringgit depending on the interest rate that you receive. Now, if we assume that the base is 350 and that is the base that we're going to go for, 350 ringgit a month saved by buying an X70 over a Honda CR-V, can be very easily added to your fuel budget to make up for this fuel consumption. In fact, you'll need a lot less than the 350 on top of your existing fuel budget in order to fuel this thing. So I guess if you take a look at it from a very sort of big picture perspective, then yes, the X70 does make a lot of sense. From a very big picture perspective, you don't mind the fact that this car consumes as much fuel as it does because in the grand scheme of things, it all works out. But in isolation, the fuel consumption is rather bad. And that is something that I hope Proton will improve upon because I'm made to understand that this engine is going to be in every Proton going forward. And if this is the fuel consumption that we're going to get, that's not great. So, does that mean that I'm condemning the X70 because of its fuel economy? No, not at all. This is a fantastic car as a total package with its comfort, refinement, practicality, and the fact that it has a significant price advantage over its competitors. The X70 is a very difficult vehicle to ignore. Even if you hate the brand for whatever reason, which is quite unreasonable if you ask me, even if you hate the brand, you cannot deny the fact that the X70 is a great package. And this car is so comfortable and so refined that I reckon it embarrasses quite a number of premium cars, let alone other vehicles within this segment. So would I recommend one? Absolutely. If you're looking for a comfortable family SUV, something that you can drive to work and back in as little fuss as possible, and you don't mind the fact that there is no Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, then the PROTON X70 makes a very, very good case for itself. However, if you use your mid-size SUV to travel, especially if you're doing longer distances, and therefore fuel economy will be of a greater priority to you, please watch our review of the Peugeot 3008 with its 1.6-litre THP engine, which puts out more power, more torque, while consuming less fuel, weirdly. And of course, if you'd rather be like everybody else, you can consider the Honda CR-V, at which point you will look like every housewife going shopping in Taipan. In any case, that's been our review of the PROTON X70 Premium 1.5. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe. Jangan bodoh.